And we are recording the session, so just so you know, you may be on camera. It looks like nobody's on camera at the moment. We would love you to unmute that if possible, and your mute and unmute is over there on the left bottom of your screen. If you do wish to receive CME, CEU, or a attendance certificate this morning, we do need you to announce your name here in just a minute. You can do that through the chat box, which Jeannie and I will monitor during the session. Our disclosure and accreditation statement. And we do have a partnership with Molina Healthcare and Blue Cross Blue Shield New Mexico. You can be reimbursed for any case consultations that you bring to us, and that's a big part of AHI New Mexico. We will have some sessions specifically for those case consultations. So please get in touch with either Jeannie or myself or Michelle Widener about that. We do also have our asynchronous online training sessions. So all of these are being recorded and we upload those, and you have to take a little bit of a quiz in order to get credit for that. You can get CME credit for those as well as for the certificate program. So please let me know or Michelle know if you have any questions. Excuse me, any questions about that. And at this point, if you can unmute and you have the ability to, if you're on the phone or if you have your microphone, please let us know who you are and where you're from. That would be great. Otherwise, we'd like to hear you through the chat box. Hi, everybody.
Good morning.
And I suppose we should just go ahead and go around the room and introduce ourselves.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Adolescent Health Initiative New Mexico. I see that it looks like Catherine already has a fan club who's been signing on. So welcome to everyone who's joining us this morning. Again, my name is Jeannie Dalen, clinical psychologist, and I will be your moderator for today. So before I introduce today's speaker and topic, let's go ahead and go around the room and welcome those who are joining us in Envision Studios this morning.
My name is Andrea Anderson. I'm a QI specialist at Envision.
I'm Beth Medelstadt. I'm a medical student from UNM.
Kirsten Bennett, pediatric dietitian.
Maya Trujillo, quality specialist at Envision.
Excellent. So for this morning, we have a wonderful speaker. We are in the midst, as everyone knows, that this is our behavioral health format for our Adolescent Health Initiative for the spring 2017 season. And who we have today is Dr. Catherine Lindberg, who is the Manager of Behavioral Health at Truman Health Services and School-Based Health Center. And she is giving us a great talk today that's entitled Your Brain on Adolescence, which is basically a cognitive behavioral developmental perspective on adolescence and what we can expect during this time period. So I'm very happy to welcome you today, and the same with the rest of Envision. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a clinical psychologist, like Jeannie said, and today I'm going to talk with you about what goes on in the brains of adolescents and what that then looks like in terms of the behaviors that we see. And if you have questions at any point, please let us know. You can use the chat feature or unmute. My hope is that we can have conversations and we can talk about what you're seeing in terms of care with adolescents, and I can help inform that with what's going on developmentally in the brain. And bear with me, I'm just learning the technology here. So today what we're going to talk a little bit about is cognitive development during various stages of adolescence. So early adolescence, middle adolescence, late adolescence is characterized by different sort of landmark cognitive processes. We'll also talk about identifying ways in which adolescents are different and how they think differently than us adults and differently than children. And then we'll talk a little bit, we won't go into a lot of depth, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the theories of adolescent thought and cognitive development. So if you've ever seen or interacted or been an adolescent, you probably experienced the lovely trifecta of the ego, logic, emotion in how adolescents think and feel and behave. These involve things like egocentrism, which I'll talk about and give you a definition of, formal operational thought processes, and then post-formal thought processes, those two of which come from Piaget's theory of child and adolescent cognitive development. So egocentrism, I like to think of this, if anyone has ever watched the movie or read the book, The World According to Garp, this is effectively what adolescents are. It's the world according to themselves. They are the center of the universe. They're special snowflakes, all of them. And they don't really have any sort of sense that anything bad can ever happen to them. And when it does, they sort of dismiss it as a unique and outside. Really, they're not sure exactly why it happened, but it doesn't affect them in the same way it does adults. And they also believe everyone is watching them all the time, which explains, if you've ever watched them interact with each other, why they are so sensitive to feedback from their peers, adults, the environment. I guess it's not really the world according to Garp with this generation. It'd be more like Kardashian style of thinking. But that's really how adolescents are in general. All of them are like this. In early adolescence, we start to see the beginnings of this, and this is the middle school age. This is an area that I think often gets sort of dismissed. We don't talk a lot about middle school age. We don't talk a lot about early adolescence, but this is a really, really important time period in adolescent cognitive development. What we're starting to see is a really impressive growth in brain development. So they have a lot of capacities that are being developed. At the same time, they're dealing with all of the trials and tribulations of middle school. So puberty, anybody remember puberty? That was pretty painful, right? They have a lot of interpersonal types of drama that affects them. That's really common with this early adolescence group. They also are starting to experience a greater evaluative experience, so they're going to be competing or comparing themselves to their peers more readily at this age. Unfortunately, it seems like this age doesn't always get as much focus in terms of also the onset of risk behaviors. In my practice, I mostly treat adults, and I can tell you without fail, most of the people who engage in what we consider high-risk behaviors, drug use, unprotected sex, things like that, started those types of behaviors or had their introduction to those behaviors in this middle school, 10 to 14 early adolescence, which means that we need to be thinking about this age group and thinking about what their capacities are, the fact that they have this great brain development going on, and what the opportunities are both in schools and in our health clinics in terms of maximizing intervention effects with this. So when we talk about middle schoolers, predominantly we're talking about besides home, their primary point of contact is in schools. So we talk about schools as environments in which we can actually improve their cognitive development, help engage them, help develop the brain in a way that it helps with reducing risk, improving problem solving, things like that. Interestingly, the research suggests that this age group should be in class for longer periods and have opportunities to get more involved in the information that they're provided, but that isn't reflected in how our educational system often works. They also don't recommend that the students get as much shifting of environment, that they actually retain an environment. And part of the theory behind this is that it establishes a safe environment, a physically safe environment in which they can engage more readily with the information, which is incredibly important for brain development and the preservation of neurons in the brain. So these are some of the recommendations. In terms of designing interventions, similar types of recommendations exist. One is starting education early and often. Believe it or not, 10 to 14-year-olds really are hungry for information. They like it. Their brains do have capacity. They do appreciate really anybody who will give them information. In the absence of an adult who is a competent adult to give them information, they will get information from their peers or older adolescents, which is where we get into a little bit of difficulty. They also like to be engaged. So even though they like to talk back and they often isolate, they really want to be part of a process. They don't want to be dictated to. And this is part of that cognitive development. They're sort of branching out, establishing themselves, developing some autonomy. So engaging them in a learning process is really important, especially given what's going on in the brain. And it's a great way to continue brain development. I talked about earlier, providing safe environments. This is particularly important. As your brain is blossoming and growing, you're going to be taking risks. Having a safe environment in which you can talk through risk-taking, decision-making becomes really important at this age. And engaging young people in life decision skills. They're pretty resistant to being told what to do. I have actually a teenage niece and nephew, and definitely a hallmark of how they interact is, I don't want you to tell me, I will have a conversation with you. I want to participate in whatever decisions you're making about my life. So compared to young kids, adolescents are amazing arguers. They're all going to be great lawyers at some point. With the brain development we're seeing, it's a period of incredible brain growth. There are actually two really important periods of brain growth. One is when you're about 2 to 3 years old, and the other is in adolescence. This is a prime opportunity to learn new skills, new techniques. They also hold on to knowledge in this really remarkable way because they've had this amazing brain growth. They're also better at using memory strategies, and they do remember things and they will bring them up. That's really common. And they're very fast thinkers. They sort of go from point 1 to point 2 to point 3 as rapidly as possible. Often it feels a little bit, if you are a middle school teacher or high school teacher, that they're running circles around you because they jump from thing to thing so quickly. So here are some of the things that are going on at the brain level. With the synaptogenesis, we get increased myelination, which improves and is why we see that rapid thought process. So that's going to move messages through the brain much more rapidly. You see an increase in synaptic connections. We also see pruning occurring. So pruning is the process by which unused neurons are eliminated effectively. And this is all really good. So again, learning new skills, learning new tasks becomes imperative at this point because we're seeing so much brain development. Predominantly in the early to middle adolescence, they are driven, their behavior is driven by limbic system reactivity. So this is where we see they react to emotion, and they're not always the best at problem solving or taking a step back and being analytical. This doesn't mean they can't learn it. It just means that predominantly in adolescence, when we compare them to adult reactions and we show them particular visual stimuli, they're going to be driven much more by amygdala activation. So the amygdala in the brain lights up. I should get a picture of a lighting up amygdala. And they respond much more rapidly because of this incredible brain growth. So they're going to respond to facial cues more rapidly. They're going to respond to tone of voice more rapidly, and it's going to come from an emotion part of their brain. While all of this is occurring, and we are getting frustrated with our adolescents who respond to things on emotion, it's also important to know that they're starting to get more logical processing. So they start to think more logically. They're able to create hypotheticals about themselves and about other people. They're able to engage with abstract thinking and inductive and deductive reasoning. So this is the point. So this is about middle adolescence. So we're talking about 14 to 17. When we start to see this emergence of, they can start to engage and appreciate how other people might feel. They can start to think about, if I do X, what might happen? So what are the hypothetical consequences of this action? And this is really important because I think we sometimes underestimate that adolescents actually have these capacities. They have to be supported, though, by their environment. So environments become really important in helping adolescents develop this process. Doesn't seem to happen just on its own. If an environment does not promote these types of opportunities, it delays the development of this formal operational thought process. I'm talking really quickly, so I just want to check in and see if anyone has any questions so far. Okay, we'll go with no. All right, so deductive reasoning. This is sort of where you start with an idea and then you use logic to draw specific conclusions about something. So if I see a duck, I assume it will waddle and quack because I have these ideas about what ducks do. That's a very simplified example, but that is part of the reasoning process that adolescents, middle adolescents start to engage with. And there are opportunities for us as providers and parents and teachers to help engage these young people in this process. That becomes really important, especially in their educational process, so that they are activating this, this formal operational stage of thought. So inductive is, instead of top down, bottom up. So saying something is something and then attributing certain characteristics, using those characteristics to then make inferences about other types of things. So in this example, I'm going to stick with the duck. It waddles and quacks. This other thing that I'm observing also does, but it doesn't look exactly the same, but it must be a duck given my my specific experience, and then my going to a general conclusion. I have a little picture of a formal operational task. As you can see, this is our aging teenager. So the little one on the, oh, I think they have a pointer right there. Does it work? No.
Works for us, but they can't see it.
Okay.
You have to use
Sorry.
your mouse.
Yeah.
So right, oh, oops. I got it, I think.
Sorry.
So right here we have this little one who's trying to figure out a balanced scale, and he's clearly not an adolescent yet. As he gets older, he starts to play with and generate some hypotheses about what to do. And then you see that as this young person grows, they start to get a better perspective on how things work, and they can engage in that hypothetical thinking process and generate hypotheses to see, okay, if I put this here and I put that there, at what point will that balance? And then it becomes even more complex because most kids kind of get the half full type of proportion, but here 2 is a much smaller proportion of 8. And as we go through adolescence, we're able to better test our hypotheses, figure out what's going on, and actually solve problems. So adolescents do have a capacity to solve problems. They just don't always engage that skill. What I love about adolescents is that because they're so focused on themselves, they recognize themselves as important and special. They also start to think about the future, and they often challenge processes in ways that adults don't do, or children for that matter. They will question the values and practices that they were raised with. This is all totally normal and really an important process. And our best approach to that is, instead of quashing that or telling them that that's not okay, inviting it and having really good, rich conversation. Because their ability to do this is what helps their brain develop and will set them up with the skills and strategies that they need as adults to go on to be future oriented, to be able to consider other people's perspectives, to think about what their lives will look like, and to set goals that are reasonable and attainable. So it's important that as adults, we reinforce and support this, even at times when it is very challenging. Because I often talk to parents and teens, and one of the biggest concerns is my teenager asks me thousands of questions about why we do these things. And I want them to stop. And I can appreciate that. Also, what I usually recommend to parents is invite these conversations. Create the space for them to happen, because if the child isn't having these conversations with their parent or a trusted adult, they're having them with someone, and that means they could be getting perspectives that are inconsistent with the family values. So if you're really intent on passing on your values to your children, this is an opportunity, knowing that this is part of what we see in adolescent thought development, and really important. And also for parents, really scary. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about formal operational thinking and analytical processing. There's also intuitive thinking. This is predominant in adolescence. And again, this stems from that very strong amygdala reaction. So emotional reactions drive their behavioral choices. It doesn't mean it's logical. It does mean that it is very quick, and it is often very strong. So this is your teenager, and you are having a conversation, and you're not even sure what you said, but they reacted, and it was in this very big way that doesn't make any sense with the rest of the conversation. And may not be logical at all, but this is really how they develop intuition. And they do learn the ability to slow down the emotional reactivity part and balance it with logic, but it does take time and support from adults in their life. So what does this look like in a health setting? And I realize I'm supposed to talk to everyone else, but I would love to hear from people in the room what they've seen when they interact with adolescents. So we're talking about that middle to later adolescent stage.
Well, I have a teenage daughter still at home, so I
Okay.
get to see this every day.
Kristen, what does it look like?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, I have 3 children. My other 2 are adults now, but they all were. We got into this, the emotional piece, so I can see that. But it's one of those things. I was being a little self-reflective. I'm still very intuitive myself, you know, and I would, some people would consider that a character flaw, but there's a part of that that I think doesn't go away, you know, that ability, and maybe I'm stereotyping. Women tend to maybe do that more than others, that sort of emotional, limbic, intuitive kind of decision-making or reaction to situations. But it's interesting, my daughter points it out to me, and then I tell her, you're right. But that's new. The 3rd time around, I think it's better.
Yeah.
You know, I had practiced with the older 2, and having my daughter see me interact with the older kids, because there's a big gap between, you know, she thought, of course, she had the right to have conversations at a different level at a younger age. She had that model. But it is, you know, I do see that.
Mm-hmm.
And she will call me out on it. And I've, you know, gotten to the point where I'm like, yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean it that way, or yes, I overreacted, or, but it's hard when she's overreacting. And I said, well, you remember, just like what you told me,
Right.
that we both overreacted to this thing. One of the things that I think that I've seen that's helpful is just for me to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily my personality. I'd rather us work it out. But I've learned, you know, 3rd time around that it's basic just to say, oh, you know, okay, we'll talk about it later.
Right.
So I don't know if that's the, you know, right way to do it, but it seems like it works in our household.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. I don't know that there's a right way, but there are more effective and less effective ways. And one of the challenges with if you think about this as an adolescent perspective, one of the challenges, adults are always sort of pushing to problem solve and fix, and they're really pretty unwilling to do that because they're coming from a place of emotion. That emotion has to turn down a little before they can engage in the problem I see this in schools where teachers and students something will happen, the student will explode. Next thing you know, they're all in the principal's office, and the teacher's like, I told them we needed to work it out, we needed to work it out, we needed to work it out. The kid wasn't in a place to be able to do that. I think when you know this about teens and you know how to take that step back, you get a lot more power in terms of when we get back together, how do we work through this? Knowing that they also have the analytic side, they're not missing that. It's not like they're completely emotional and not analytic. But your point is really important in terms of when we work with these young people. If a teenager happens to be in my office and they explode about something, I'm going to let them have their space and some time and maybe some crayons or whatever they want. And then we'll come back and have a conversation about what happened when they're ready, sort of giving them some power, some decision making, because autonomy is so important to them at this age.
And it's too bad we didn't have that, lesson ahead of time, that it took 3 kids to figure it out. And I have an education, it's just, it's the manual they don't come with.
Right.
And it's not just for adolescents, for all the other stages that we talk about, but
yeah.
And I think this is why people are afraid of adolescence.
Oh, this is absolutely why people are afraid of adolescence, and it's why I love them. And most people look at me a little sideways, like, really? What do you like about adolescence? I love this. They are really authentic in who they are, and that is a huge strength, and I don't think we should try to eliminate that. If we could all carry forward into adulthood that sense of our importance, our place in the world, with our hopefulness, it's a beautiful gift. So I think this is a good thing to know, and also to think about how do we interact with this in an effective way. The other thing about adolescents is they're really adaptive. So they learn how to utilize certain types of thought processes in different types of contexts and with different people. And with their parents, they tend to be much more of the intuitive, emotional responding. In school, they often will pull into the analytic perspective a lot more, but they are learning to be adaptive. Young children don't have this adaptive piece as much. They're sort of what they are through every context. But in adolescence, we start to see some discrimination between, this is the behavior I am when I'm playing soccer, this is how I am when I'm in class, this is how I am when I'm with my mom, this is how I am with my friends. So they do start to learn more efficient ways of being in situations. So they're really pretty savvy, all in all. What's remarkable about the brain at this level is that it's highly plastic, meaning they can do quite a bit of damage to themselves and their brains bounce back, which is promising. That's good. That does not mean we encourage them to do damage to their brain, but it does mean that the brain is very adaptive at this stage, due to, in large part, the huge amount of synaptic growth that we see. So we also see in this middle to late adolescence, again, we're looking at the 14 to 17 and above set. And we see much more prefrontal lobe activation. This is the executive planning part of the brain. This is the part that slows people down. This is the part that will continue to mature. But now with new imaging data, it doesn't look like it fully matures until about age 25. So we used to think adolescents magically were done developing at about 18 or 19. And it turns out that's not completely accurate. So when you see risky behaviors in 25-year-olds or highly emotional types of relating in that 22 to 25-year-old set, just remember they're in late adolescence and their prefrontal lobe has not completely finished developing. So again, you're still dealing with a very strong amygdala reaction that they're learning to manage or learning to control better. This is important interestingly, in college. College students, often the expectation is that they'll behave similarly to adults, and that expectation may not completely be helpful to the college students who are still developing and learning and really need the supportive environment. And this is true for non-college young adults as well, or late adolescents.
Is there a gender difference?
In
You know, well,
Yeah,
and not in a bad way. You know, again, my 2 older children are boys, and smart people, right? But you know, it's one of these things that we keep talking about with them is that, you know, you're still they're about in that age. You know, they're late, you know, late adolescence. But I'm just wondering, is there a gender difference so that if we are working with a population of adolescents, that we should be more concerned, proactive, whatever, with, you know, girls at a particular age because we've got a shorter period of time or a longer period of time, or maybe there's no difference. In other words, it's 25, 26 for everybody, and we just, you know, plow through the.
I think it's highly variable. The predominant themes are that young women's prefrontal lobe development occurs at a more rapid pace. It also could be cultural in terms of what we engage women in and ask of them at pretty young ages, in terms of decision making, planning, processing, things like that. I think there's a little bit of a cultural difference in terms of how we interact with young men, and I'm going to try and say this so it doesn't sound pejorative against men, but we tend to dismiss young male risk behavior as just part of being a young man.
Boys being boys.
Yeah, and that cultural theme really is not as supportive in helping them engage that prefrontal activation and slowing themselves down. So it's hard to know if it's really truly due to gender or sex differences, or if it's actually a cultural phenomenon and what expectations are set on people. Keeping in mind, the structure that adolescents need is really important. That safety, like having a safe place to take some risks, calculated risks where they get good support, they can have conversations, they can engage in the process of being part of decision making. I think young girls, especially really young girls, are engaged in those processes early on and often in a way that boys are not always engaged in.
And is that something, you mentioned the educational system, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something that we do different in our sort of educational system that could support, other than the room changes and some of those kinds of things that you were talking about?
Yeah, I think the boys will be boys phenomenon exists pretty early throughout the educational system. There's some evidence that we often will not pay as close of attention to problematic behavior from boys until it escalates to a certain level, and with girls the first time someone intervenes with them. So again, culturally it's very different. Also, activities, extracurricular activities. Girls tend to engage in extracurricular activities that lend themselves to more activation of the prefrontal lobe, doing more problem solving and planning, and boys often do activities that are a little bit more emotional, like football. There's a little bit more aggression, and that's reinforced. So I have theories about this. There's some literature to support it, but we don't know. Our best comparisons are cross-cultural comparisons. So this is not the same across every culture. So in cultures where young men are expected to provide for families very early on or to go to work, we see a little bit different. We actually see that they're very good at doing planning and execution, and there's not as much of the impulsive aggression types of behavior. So keeping in mind that community factors affect this, family factors affect this. There are lots of even things like politics affect this. Pretty much everything can affect these. These are more general, just what we expect. Okay. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go on to this. Okay. So most adolescents will talk about feeling bored in school. This is really common. And teachers complain of student apathy. So again, this is your middle adolescence to late adolescence. Part of it is the emphasis on peer relationships really interrupts the process of learning in the classroom. So they're much more interested in fitting in. and they're much more interested in developing their network of support than they are in engaging with educational material. Jeannie's laughing.
I have a 14-year-old I'm seeing that fits this. It's like so perfect.
Yeah, and I want to go back to, given what we know about their brain developing, they do have the capacity. Again, it's keeping them interested and engaged. And I think the way we do education, where we sit and we are just passive receivers of information, is not going to engage the adolescent brain in the same way that the peer dynamics, which are always changing, it's always problem solving, they're always having to figure out something new. That's much more compelling to an adolescent brain that's developing and creating all these new neural networks than sitting there receiving information without a lot of literally physical movement and engagement in the process. So extracurricular activities become really important. They're also a place where these young people get that structure, where it creates the safety, it creates the opportunities, it creates a place where they can start to develop their positive sense of self, and they start to develop decision-making skills. So extracurricular activities are really important. What we know is many kids aren't involved in extracurricular activities for lots of reasons. They don't have access to them. There's not enough of them to meet the student body needs. They don't have the resources to participate in them. Some of these extracurricular activities can become very expensive. And so when you think about, if we have a population of young people who are dropping out of school, part of that is that they're not engaged. We're not doing a very good job at the educational level of creating environments for learning that are engaging and are going to improve that motivation, and will probably also tap into that need for connectedness. These young people really want to have support, and they'll get it wherever they can get it. We did a study, I don't even know, published that, in Atlanta with some adolescent young people, and we asked them who they wanted to get information from, and by and large they said their parents. We told their parents this, and their parents were completely shocked. They thought that they didn't ever want to talk to them, and that they would prefer to get information from their friends. But what that tells us is, in the absence of good information from parents or from trusted adults, kids really, really crave connectedness. Adolescents need this connection, and they'll get it where they can get it, which is also why in some of the environments I've worked, wanting to join a gang is really important, and it's really important because it creates connectedness. And they do learn in that environment. It might not be what we would hope for them to learn, but it is a learning environment and a very supportive and safe environment for this process to occur. So then as we move into the late adolescent phase, we're looking at more post-formal thought. So this is where we balance the intuitive analytic. Yes, there are, we all have one that we tend to rely on more, but it is the ability to balance it that is really characteristic of the about 17 to 25-year-old period. And this helps balance out how they interact with the world. It turns out you can't go through life getting angry at every person who upsets you. That doesn't actually work in terms of effectiveness. You're not going to get what you want most of the time. Jeannie's going to yell at me. And adolescents actually learn this process through interactions with their peers. Most people don't want to be friends with another kid who is emotionally reactive all the time. That is pretty difficult. When we think about young people who are struggling with ADHD, they're going to struggle with learning this balance, and that's part of helping them will be helping them learn how to do this process a little bit more overtly, given the limitations that their brain has naturally. So with this stage of post-formal thought, we get more flexibility. Flexibility is really important. It helps us to show or hide our emotional reactions in certain contexts. I love the example that it says not crying in front of your boss. Well, that sometimes happens too, but it's the ability to know when it is and is not appropriate to do certain things. So teens, like I said earlier, and adolescents, we see a lot more increase in cognitive flexibility. And this cognitive flexibility will be very adaptive as adults. We value that. We look for that when we hire people, when we go to graduate school, when we get a job. These are things that are really important. So young people do learn this, and they actually can learn it a lot in their peer interactions, interestingly. Peers give each other feedback, really accurate feedback about what's working and what's not working. And so that connectedness group type of process is really important for developing cognitive flexibility. And the two processes we learn cognitive flexibility through are accommodation and assimilation. This is, I see this a lot in late high school and early, I guess, I'll call it college age for the sake of being more age specific. But these two processes are really important. In assimilation, the young person is fitting the new information into their pre-existing beliefs or schemas of what's happening. And then in accommodation, they're adapting their previous theories about things with the new information. So I'm going to give you an example for myself. When I was 18, I lived in another country for a month. I got to go on an exchange for a month. It was very exciting. I had very strong beliefs that the United States was the greatest country in the world. And when I came back from Sweden, that had been accommodated to recognize that I had new ideas about how the world perceived us and how I perceived my own country based on living outside of it for a period of time. So that's part of that accommodation. I had to change my theory, like, okay, maybe the US is pretty great, but there are other countries that are really pretty great too. So I had to give up a little bit of my previous belief. And I did based on the new information and new experiences I had. This process can be really helpful in creating that flexibility because some things we want to hold on to. There are going to be values or beliefs that we hold that we carry forward through our life, and we want to adapt information to that. So we want to assimilate new information into it. But there are some beliefs that it's really okay for us to change. So if you go through high school believing that boys are bad, you might want to change that at some point if you have to ever interact with boys. So these two processes are really what describe what is happening. So I'm going to end on that. I've given you a little bit of my own perception or my own experience with assimilation and accommodation. But I want to end with, it's really important that kids go to college. And really, it's not just college, it's any structured environment in which they have the opportunity to continually develop these skills, given that they don't really stop, they're not fully developed at the age of 18. So it can be anything from a program for training, it can be going to volunteer work, it can be going to college, it can be any structured environment in which they have the opportunities to get feedback, to take some small risks, and to have the structure and support for them to continue to develop cognitively. This is my little college is great. Let's send kids to college. So I'm going to stop now, and if there are any questions, I would love to answer them.
Absolutely. Catherine, thank you. I think this is a lot of food for thought in what was presented. As we wait to see, as people are mulling over this information, one of the comments I had for what you talked about, when so much of the response, behavioral response, comes from the limbic system, and it's so emotional and big and bold. One of the things I noticed as well is that I think where, as providers, we feel uncomfortable with that is because, like you said, we want to do the problem solving and the fixing and the hashing it out. And one of the things I noticed is that kids tell me a lot, like, I don't have the language to tell you how I'm feeling right now. I can tell you I'm feeling very upset and I don't like it, but the actual language of where this is coming from and why is missing. And so working with that in a clinical setting and even in the hospital where we're trying to like get information and what's going on and to prescribe, it can be difficult when they're just like, I don't know, I just feel, but I can't speak.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you have a question, but one of the
Just
things I
comment.
often do with young people is I don't worry so much about the language to describe things. I actually focus more on what they're sensing. So do they feel warm? Do they feel cold? Do they feel tight? Do they feel loose? What does their body feel like?
Mm-hmm.
And then we start to play with some words, and I kind of will give them some options about, do you think this is what is going on? Do you think it feels more like this in your experience? And so that's an opportunity to help them learn new vocabulary around what they're feeling and what they're experiencing based on those very basic sensations of their body.
Yeah, like sometimes if you begin to start talking for them, they can at least say yes or no, and then sometimes that's the end.
And they do like the one-word answers.
Yes, they do.
Adolescents tend to do that. I don't usually take that as a barrier. I take that as they're at least engaged and an opportunity to continue to support learning. So they're taking in all this information and they're processing it. And when I've worked with adolescents, usually by our third or fourth visit, they're like, I had this experience, this is what it felt like, and I think this is what it is. Nice. And so they start to integrate. Remember, they're integrating all of the feedback that we're giving them, and they are loving that we're actually engaging with them and saying, so do you think it's this? Do you think it's that? What does this feel like? Because all of that is an opportunity to develop their language center, and it helps develop the neuronal networks.
Mm-hmm. I have another question or comment as we go through. One of the interesting things too, I think, in terms of the provider versus parent relationship, like in the health clinic, is we talk about adolescents having environments to do small calculated risks. And I think parents have, in very much being a parent, wanting the best for their child, see that risk behavior as, oh my gosh, this could continue into the future. And so they stay to the catastrophized risk behaviors. And so what tends to happen is then there's a disconnect between the kids in terms of dialogue, because it's like, we will not talk about this, you will not do that behavior. And when they're just trying to figure things out, and I think for us as providers too, understanding how to negotiate when someone comes in and says, I'm engaging in this risk, without going, oh my God, like you shouldn't be doing that.
Right. I think that's a really common concern. Often when I worked in family practice, I got referrals back that were specifically the parent was concerned about something, and they wanted me to see the kid. So I often did, and I often got from the parent what they were concerned about, and then we would talk about what is this behavior we're seeing, and in what way, what function does it have for the kid? So what about this behavior is important to this child at this time? And if kids, when you look at it from the perspective of you're doing it for some good reason, kids are much more likely to have a discussion about why they're doing it. It feels good. It's a way to connect to people. It's so I can stay connected to my peer group. They're not going to say it that way.
Right.
My friends told me I should do it. So I think those are knowing that and being willing to open the dialogue, and then you can say, okay, are there any consequences? Could anything bad happen if you're doing this? What do you think about that? Again, when I talked about early adolescence, engaging them in the problem-solving process. So they like to be engaged with, not dictated to. And I think anytime we can open up the dialogue, which takes a great deal of courage, I've watched my sister parent, takes a lot of courage to say, okay, I'm going to take a deep breath, and this kid is bringing this to me, which means that they want someone to talk about it with, and this is an opportunity. And usually when I've talked to young people, they do want to talk about it with someone, and their parents won't do it. And so we might be that person for them in that moment, and helping them identify other safe adults who can support them and have those conversations. Next time they're going to come to you before they engage in the risk and problem solve, like, so why am I wanting to do this? Why don't I want to do it? What's the consequence? When I explain that to parents, we usually have to do at least one of those conversations with me there, because they're very nervous, but usually they get better at it.
Great. There is a comment from Felicia, or a question. I worked at a health clinic at a middle school a few years back, and I found it almost impossible to engage some younger middle schoolers in their care, especially 6th and 7th grade boys. I came to feel like having a healthcare visit without a parent was not useful, except for giving vaccines or something very straightforward. What do you think, Catherine? Strategies?
I think that's a tough age group. They're not super verbal, so they're not going to be giving you open-ended questions are not the best strategy with that age group. I definitely would ask questions that are yes or no, and then look for space to have a bigger discussion about something. I don't know if they're presenting for care of something or if they're being referred for care of something, but engaging with an adult is not a bad idea. And asking them, maybe it's a teacher who they trust the most, someone who that you can help them engage a little bit in the healthcare process. I will say one of the things that concerns me a little is that young people really don't have a good sense about healthcare. They're not very health literate. And so I think also, again, I'm going to go back to, and I wish we did more at the educational, broad, school-based level, just in terms of educating young people about health, why you would go to a medical visit, what types of things medical providers can do for you. So yes, I think your comment is really well taken. It is a challenge. I think with that age group, I would stick to the yes or no questions and then see if you happen to ask a question and it give you a much longer answer. That is your doorway to engage with the young person. But that will be that can be a challenging group.
But it sounds like even planting seeds and letting them know, giving us an education just in general about what healthcare visits could be.
Absolutely.
Could be work. Could work. Yeah,
yes. So even suggestions and saying, this is what we do at the clinic. If at any point you want this, let me know. You're welcome to come back. Can be a huge opportunity. You've planted a seed in a young boy's mind that says, this person cares about me. They're willing to help me. I'm going to try that again. And sometimes we don't see them for a couple of years. Sometimes we don't see them for a week and they're back. And it's highly variable.
So I've got a question about something you said early on, the personal fable, the invincibility fable,
Yeah.
imaginary audience. And so having seen all those things. But what is reality TV and what effect does that have on our imaginary audience? I'm just trying to think as we try to integrate technology use for kids, and it's now almost required in school systems, that they have interaction with technology. And some of that with, again, instant messaging and Snapchat and Facebook and, Instagram and Twitter and all of these things, that idea that you're on display all the time, it's even in Facebook, that it looks like everybody's on vacation. It
does.
Yeah.
A little bit.
How come I'm not one of those people on vacation all the time? But I don't know if you have any comments about how that might affect how we work with adolescents when they have access to this audience all the time.
Right. I think it's a great point. I would love to see more research on this, but what I have seen just in practice, when I first started years ago in graduate school seeing adolescents, they didn't have as much contact with technology. So we saw those things sort of go away or not be as intense as they got older. Now I'm seeing it sticking around a lot longer. And with that, so they have this audience all the time, they're the center of the universe, but they don't always know the risk involved with it. And so I think that is where our role becomes so important is, yes, you always are the center of the universe on Twitter or Facebook. And what are the possible risks associated with that? And start learning to calculate risk associated with it. I've also seen young people who come to my office and can't figure out why they haven't been discovered. And I am baffled, to be fair. I had no idea what. But because reality television influences them so much, and because they think this is how we move forward, I think this is where parents become so important, schools become so important, trusted adults and health clinics become important, because we're role modeling what it looks like to get an education, to work a day, a hard day, not just a light day, with the television or the cameras around. So it's a great question. I think we have to be really thoughtful about what we're going to see. And my worry is we're going to extend adolescence out before the end of my career to about 35. Just with this belief that we're all special, we should all have our own YouTube channel. I'm going to be famous. I don't need to go work. I don't need to learn a task. I don't need to do any of that. So I am concerned about it a little bit.
So one last comment and question for you, Catherine. Violetta says, I'm teaching a class called Adolescence in a school setting this semester in MSU, and I am so happy that I covered this information in my class as well. The students were so interested in all the cognitive changes and the brain changes that occur. I'm also using Brainstorm by Siegel in the class. Great presentation. You covered a lot of info. One question, why do you think the research on middle school populations is limited? I would really like to focus my research on this population.
The biggest barrier to researching this age group is that they do need parent assent or consent and student assent to participate. And I think parents are still pretty hesitant to let their young person participate in research. Most of the data we have from this age group is population data in schools. What that means is we're pretty restricted in what kinds of questions we can ask. So we can't do as much in-depth questioning of these young people. I don't think it's a barrier that we've experienced, but it shouldn't, I think there's lots of opportunities. We just have to get a little creative about how we approach parents, how we talk about this with parents, and also how we talk about it with middle schoolers. I think if middle schoolers knew that they were participating in something that would benefit them and their friends, they'd probably sell it. You know, they're great salesmen. They can sell you anything. So that I do think that's the biggest barrier is access to the population.
Excellent. Great.
Great question, Blanca. I'm glad you're teaching that class.
Well, again, as everyone's mentioned, this is great presentation. It's very interesting, this information, and I think all of it really can kind of spur our thinking in how we work with those adolescent populations. They're not just young adults.
Right.
So I think this was great. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Again, if any other questions or comments come in, please feel free to reach out and let us know, and we can pass them on to Catherine. And again, we'll be here same time next week at 8 o'clock, and then we'll also discuss next week a little bit. I know our first case consultation forum will be coming up, so I will be checking in with everyone and make sure everyone feels comfortable with that. And if you need any help in gathering your case conference or topic, we're here to help. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great week, and we'll see you here next week, same time, same place.
And just before we end, we do have our post survey for the AHI New Mexico for today. So I just posted that into the chat box, and Michelle will send that out as well to all of our participants. So if you could just take a couple of minutes and do that, it's pretty quick, but it helps us improve our system and any issues that you might have had. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.